The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. When it comes to utility data, there's a common misconception that it's fixed and beyond your control. However, that's far from the truth. 360 Energy has created an innovative AI-powered platform designed to simplify and automate the complex process of energy and emissions data management. Introducing Envirely. Envirely provides organizations with a comprehensive solution enabling efficient management of energy usage, cost reduction, and greenhouse gas emissions reduction in alignment with global standards. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Great to be back.
It is wonderful to be back. The Conference of the Parties. Here we are.
Wow. Here we are back for our third year, an exciting year this year, I think, and John's going to give us more information on that. But to start this episode off, what was COP29 and where was it and how did it go this year?
Okay, COP29, guess what? It was the 29th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And this particular Conference of the Parties is related to climate change. There are other COPs that turn up from time to time that confuse people's name, with the names. But this was held in Azerbaijan in the city of Baku, which is a petrostate, which follows on from last year was a petrostate. So that's where it was. That's the start. What's the purpose of it all? The purpose of it all is to try and get international agreements, such as in Paris when they agreed on the 1.5 degrees C target, and also to look for mechanisms for implementation as to how we're going to make things happen. So that's the general background. And 29 was more about how to make things happen. And in fact, the subtitle that the organising country had put with it was Investing in a Livable Planet for All.
John, I know we have questions, but I'm kind of curious, and we may have addressed this before. How do they determine who gets this annual conference? Because it's now been in two kind of petrol-based locations. I'm kind of curious how that works.
Complete openness. I'm not 100% sure. It is suggested that there may be certain lobby groups and other things that have some impact on where it is. Obviously, there is a great deal of logic in a conference like this, if you're going to have it, moving it around from different locations, because the host country becomes the president of the conference and it tends to put a different slant on it. So there is some value in it moving around. I mean, we will come on to it next, but quite interestingly, COP30 will be in Brazil. So South America, which is another, part of the world that needs to be represented.
Fair enough.
But let's just talk a few figures, because this is where it always gets interesting, doesn't it? How many delegates do you think in total went to COP29? How many would you need? I mean, you've got 160 to 180 countries. How many people do you really need at a conference?
Was it like 40,000 that were there? Or
No. I can tell you it was down 15,000 on last year.
Okay.
I would think about, let's estimate, if we're talking for the purpose of this conference, getting things done, having these conversations, I would say max 5 from each country.
Yeah. There were 65,000 delegates. Okay. Let's put that into some context. 2,229 of them were from Azerbaijan. Well, I guess you're going to have a big sign up locally. 1,773 were lobbyists for coal, oil and gas. But what we get is we actually get the people representing the parties and we get the people, all the other interested groups. So to put that in context, for COP29, of the 65,000 odd there, 17,680 represented the parties who were the conference is about. Put that in contrast, COP1, which was held in Berlin in 1995, and the number of delegates representing the parties was 757.
Wow. Okay. So a couple numbers that were really interesting. Actually, we started the company in 1995, John. That's kind of
Yeah,
never to pick that up. But one of the people that I spoke to that was there conveyed that because of the demand, you could appreciate the room that he rented was $400 US a night. And he said normally it would be charged $15 a night if it was not during the
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
And you know what? When we hear these numbers, it really gets you thinking like, why are we having all these people in these rooms and what's actually being accomplished with this number of people, right? Because at this point, the more people you're sending, the more money you're investing in something like a COP. It means it has to mean that we're moving the needle a little bit more than we used to be.
Maybe, maybe not. Now, I think what is interesting to talk about as well is people who weren't there. Now, on that, we need to be fair. Heads of state normally don't attend the entire conference. They normally attend the opening ceremony and then they leave their delegates there. But looking at heads of state and people of that equivalence who were there, Joe Biden did not go. Emmanuel Macron from France did not go. Ursula von der Leyen, who's the sort of head of the EU, did not go. Some guy called Vladimir Putin, he didn't go. Olaf Scholz from Germany didn't go, but I think there is a political explanation. He was suffering issues at home, so probably going there was not. But of course, one of the non-attendees who said they were going to go and then didn't, perhaps created a bit of media traction, was Papua New Guinea. Because they basically decided that they didn't think that the COPs were any longer fit for purpose and that the low-lying Pacific Islands were not getting a fair deal out of it. And they thought that they would have more impact on the process by not going rather than going.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, yes. And I mean, I take your point, Lysandra. I think, half a dozen people, maybe 10 people per country would be fine. And you have your premier, your president endorse the thing at the beginning, and you leave your team there. But clearly, that has become far, far more complicated. I did try to do a quick bit of research because in the past we've looked at the potential travel and carbon impact of COP29. I've not been able at this point to track that down, and I'm not sure whether Azerbaijan were claiming to offset or not. But I think the offsetting and whatever is not the thing to think about. It's, how many thousands of miles of air travel were required in people going there. Now, what we do know, and I know somebody who attended not as a full delegate, but to sort of talk about things there, my understanding is that the non-conference sessions can be really interesting because these are networking between particular interest groups, and it is a great opportunity for a face-to-face because I think, we do our podcasts by video link, but it helps because we all know each other and we've met. But when you're going to try and do a deal with somebody or understand something, the face-to-face is quite important. So I think we might denigrate them for the total number of going there, but for some, there will be some particular value where people are. A good example of it is people have got a technology or something and they're looking for support, interested parties investment. It's a pretty good showcase for that. So you tend to get two things going on in parallel. You get all the very formalized, rigorous meeting sessions. You then get the spin out sessions with that. And then you've got these sort of, interested parties sort of networking. And of course, what we have to say is, were the 1,773 coal, oil and gas lobbyists, what were they trying to do? Okay, let's be a little bit fair. A number of players in oil and gas are aware that they've got to face up to the energy transition. They are working to achieve that. They have internal strategies and public declarations of what they're going to do. On the other hand, there are some who don't want to see a tapering off of fossil fuels because they want to continue with that in the business. This is going to be the guys who aren't smart enough, or that's perhaps not a kind comment, but they're not thinking about, can we move away to fossil fuels, to lower carbon fuels, to renewables, i.e. being an energy company, they're stuck with perhaps being a coal, oil and gas company.
And John, as we've learned, a lot of these people will do it because their profits are significantly higher in fossil fuel versus renewable. So that's the way the business, when you're measuring business performance, if you're measuring it based on profitability, that's their driver, is they're looking at that whole piece, meaning the bottom line, and that's why they're doing it, not taking into account the cost of pollution and what that costs the society. Right?
I mean, if you're a businessman in the fossil fuel industry, or businesswoman, it can be both. Interestingly enough, it's often businessmen who are making these decisions, not women. But typically, if you've got a relatively short, long-term perspective, what do I mean by that? You're talking 10, 15, 20 years ahead. There is clearly still a big market for fossil fuels in that period. You want your piece of that. You don't want to be restricted in what you're doing and investing. You perhaps want to be the last man standing when fossil fuels are running out, that you have that last supply of fossil fuel.
Yep.
It's a challenge.
Can I pick up? It's a little mood point, but I think it's a critical one. If you look at the demographics, historically, on the whole oil and gas side, that's been maybe a male dominated. But when you look at sustainability now, interesting enough, a majority of the sustainability leads are women.
Yeah. I think we can say with the COP that the gender balance has moved over the years.
Yes.
And let's be honest, my experience of single gender teams, male or female, don't perform as well as mixed gender teams.
Diversity is actually great, right?
Yeah. So that set the ground for it. We had a long couple of weeks of it. And as you said, we had guys paying exorbitant rates for hotel rooms. But that's the local country making I mean, let's be honest, if you'd gone to Paris during the Olympics, I think you'd have been paying more than the regular room rate.
I don't begrudge. I actually understand that model. Supply demand, that's how the price works, so I get it.
Okay, so what actually happened? Now, before we started recording, we were just chatting lightly about this, and Lysandra made the comment she didn't see quite as much about COP29 in the media as before.
And I would echo that as well. Yeah.
Now, why is that? I think because there wasn't, guess what? As always, on the last day, they were working to the last minute to sign off the agreements. I think this is standard thing, but it wasn't very exciting because we haven't come out of it with a new target. We're still looking and saying, the Paris Agreement, that's the thing that matters. So there was nothing like that came out of it.
Sorry, just to interject, COP29 took place about a week after the US elections as well. And I don't know about your feeds in the media you see, but again, I live in Canada, which is a border city to the US and is very influenced by any US sort of election. So because of that, I think a lot of the media is flooded with what's going to happen next. That maybe, let's say if a major election did not occur, maybe we would, at least just thinking of like my LinkedIn, the news I follow, maybe that would have been redirected a little more. I think that really overshadowed COP29.
I think you've got a point, but I still think, here, when we had just about got over the shock of what happened in America, how can I put it? I don't know. Right. A slight diversion to what we're talking about. We all follow mainstream media, social media and things like that. Why is it that really trivial stuff in social media goes viral and swamps everything and the really important stuff doesn't seem to? I think that's just one thing there. But the other thing with it is, I genuinely think it wasn't as interesting for the casual observer.
I would like to pick up what Lysandra said. Yes, the election had an issue, certainly that captured people's attention. I think the other thing is, John, again, this is North American based. There is now a movement that it's believed that the U.S. administration is not really interested in the energy transition or this whole issue of climate change. For whatever reason, they're going to encourage fossil fuel production. So that kind of like it's amazing how it's all of a sudden just
in 1
changed
week.
people's thinking.
It's like in 1 week, and again, the new government hasn't even started, but the conference of the parties almost meant nothing because we were hearing every single day some new information come out on what the future of this whole industry could look like from the US. So I do wonder the impact of that and how much people paid attention to COP29, because to my understanding, any decision made at COP29 doesn't really impact the US anymore because it's not something they care about.
I think, it's a slight diversion, but it's a relevant one. My reading of it is that Trump 1.0 pulled out of climate agreements. So is Trump 2.0 going to do the same thing?
Right.
Probably. However, an opinion piece I read said even though we've got Republican all the way through the three parts of the American government, there are a significant number of Republican senators, for example, who represent areas where there is, should we say, significant investment in renewable energy.
Yes, and in the technology, whether it's EV, like Georgia, like a lot of the southern, because of the IRA program, there's been a lot of money that has been spent. And I know we're really going down this pathway, but certainly that's it. And then you have Elon Musk, who seems to be the right-hand man of Trump. It'll be interesting to see what input or impact he has.
Yes.
With his thinking too.
Yeah. So it's the truth of it is, with a lot of the things, we're all going to have to wait until 2025 and the first 100 days to see just what impact this does have. When you've got a number of senators who are positive about things like that, you've got a number of corporates that are committed to net zero future and working towards it. Maybe it won't be as bad as it could be, but I think we've got to bear in mind we won't know. And I think it's going to be a really good idea for us to have a podcast maybe in March to say where do we, what impact has the new American administration had on the global efforts for tackling climate change.
Agree. One last thing, John, staying with this. I think because the future U.S. administration is very transactional, if they, coming back to your point, if they actually see the amount of money being spent or made in this transition, they might kind of change their tune a bit. We'll see what happens. So I guess we'll discuss that in the first quarter of 2025. We'll see where that.
Yeah.
Sorry for derailing this. Back to COP29.
Hey, we like we said, there's no silver bullets, there's silver buckshot, and we keep saying that. There's not, when you're talking about these things, they are complex. There are wide bits and pieces with them. So there were really two outcomes or two areas of outcome for COP29. One was climate finance, and the other one was relating to Article 6, which doesn't sound very interesting, but is actually possibly more interesting than the finance one. So let's talk about them in turn. The kind of money we're talking about when we talk finance is just incredible. My reading is that the developing countries arrived in Baku hoping to secure $1.3 trillion in annual climate finance. And they were hoping that was going to come from public sources, grants, concessionary loans, etc. So they were looking for $1.3 trillion. The final text promises a new quantified collective goal, an NQCG, of 300 billion a year by 2035. I don't know, at first, when I was looking, I go, 300 billion, that's a lot. But when somebody's actually asking for 1.3 trillion,
Yeah,
It's a
and
bit of a
John,
shortfall.
it was 100 billion in 2015, right?
That's correct. So you could look at it one way. Brilliant. It's been trebled, but
Yes.
it's still falling far short of what some people think is needed.
Can I convey, just make sure everyone understands, like we're talking about US dollars. So the US dollar is
Yes, all of this.
currently a very strong currency around the world, and I suspect it will continue. So that's huge. And so, and I also want to make sure everyone, our listeners understand, these are developing countries that did not and have not participated in economic growth or riches like countries like Canada, UK, US, and others, right? These are people that have not had that revolution. And so they're now paying a price because of climate change, and they're looking for a heads up or support to enable them to advance because of climate change. That's what this $300 billion is worth, or that's the purpose of it, right?
Yes, and I mean there was a number of comments been made, but one was that the NQCG text represents wealthy economies shirking their climate responsibilities, and developing countries and a number of other stakeholders were unhappy with the agreement and describing it as a betrayal. Coming back to our point, the person who's making these observations said, with uncertainty about climate action brewing in the US, there's little optimism that the public climate finance landscape will evolve positively before COP30 in Brazil.
This is going to be extremely interesting because this is going to have what countries do participate could have a huge influence on those developing countries going forward. So let me just play this out because I think has been happening. China's been actively involved in different markets, developing markets. And for that reason, I think they're now getting indoctrinated in different economies that maybe weren't receptive to this before. I'll be interested to see how this plays out going forward, who actually participates
Yeah.
going forward, right?
Now, one of the points that's made is of course, this money is probably going to be a blend of what we would call public and private money. And one of the comments made, and it's an interesting one, is that developed countries are probably reluctant to pledge finance from public sources for reasons both fiscal and political.
So I was at a sustainable finance conference in Ottawa last week, and then that was made very clear that governments will not be able to do this. They'll need to rely on private involvement to make that happen because they just don't have the capacity to do this.
Well, I mean, I bring in a UK perspective to it. We've had this will sound trivial in comparison, but we have a thing here that senior citizens, pensioners, over a particular age were given a certain allowance every year called the winter fuel allowance. And the thinking was that when you're older, you're at home more, you probably need it warmer, so you need something to help you. This was given as a blanket to anybody regarding it. There was no means test or anything with it. And the argument for that was it was more effective to give all pensioners the same money than to work through qualifying them all.
Yep. Yep.
Okay. So that was there. We're talking 150, £200 sterling, something of that sort of order. So the government's trying to balance the books here. And so it's one of the things it removes. The minute it removed it, you see responses for people. Why are we paying money into foreign aid when we can't even keep our pensioners warm? Now, it's an awful spin on it, but it's the political reality. If you're in a country that's got economic issues and then you turn around and say, oh, by the way, we're going to give, £10 million, dollars to developing countries to help them tackle climate change, you'll get all sorts of political kickback like, what will they do with the money? Can we trust them with it? And if we're sending that money, what are we doing at home? And if we're making America great again, are we going to be keen for big chunks of public money to be going to other countries?
Yeah, and I want to reinforce, I think there's going to be more and more pressure in economies, whether it's the UK, Canada, and others, that have been, quite frankly, in comparison to these newly developing countries, like there'll be more and more pressure to, because we don't have the money. That, like, you're hearing more and more about not having the capacity or spending money to do this. So it's going to be quite an interesting exercise how this develops.
Yeah, and if we're talking something slightly broader, and it hasn't come up much in my reading on this, but this is all to do, what's sometimes referred to as the just transition. Where's climate justice? Because we've talked about this before. We represent developed countries. Arguably, the UK kicked off global warming because we had the Industrial Revolution, and then people learnt from us and did the same. We started burning coal like there was no tomorrow. And we, the developed countries, have generated the majority of what the problem is. And so the just approach says, well, surely then you should be paying back taxes, if you like, for all those emissions that you made. And morally, it's a difficult argument to argue with. Politically and economically, you've got to argue with it because you haven't got the money.
Yeah.
So that's what happened there. So is it good? It was better than nothing. I always wonder, though, whether, unless it had been the full 1.3 trillion, there would have always been some negative comment from the developing countries, and understandably, because this is the thing about negotiation, isn't it? The ideal negotiation is when both parties come to the table and go away both thinking they've won. Now, that's not happened in this case. So that's where we are. And what will happen in the next year? Because the thing we often forget, well, we don't forget, but we forget sometimes to make the point of it. It's all very well, all these people sitting down in Baku and talking about these things, but they then have to go back to their own countries and enact them, get approval or whatever, unless they happen to have gone there with pre-approval. But typically they haven't. So, it's all a case of, you've got to go back and then ratify whatever you've agreed with your home government.
The economist in me, I'm thinking, is that 300 billion in today's terms in 2035, or is it 300 billion in 2035? Like, I'm kind of interested.
That's really interesting, because if you start doing your sort of inflation, your discounted cash or whatever, there is a big difference if talking of $20, $35 and dollars of today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No one talked about that.
I'm sure if we okay, why haven't I delved into this further is a good question, because outside of what's reported and the headlines, have you seen just how much paper this conference produces? It is incredible, and we have to be reliant really on a number of dedicated observers and people who've got a particular interest in it, sort of pre-processing most of this so that we've got something that we can understand. And there is part of me goes, well, a billion here, a billion there. What's that all about? And they are figures that are difficult to get to grips with. And perhaps we should be doing something of understanding what that means. And what I don't fully understand, I'm going to be honest, that's fine getting that money, but then the good question is, how is it spent? What is it spent on?
What's the percentage breakdown by developing country?
Who gets which part of this pie?
Yes. No, there's lots of details that are really quite...
Yeah. Okay, so that's the finance part of it. Then Article 6, I think, becomes interesting, because Article 6 is the bit that covers carbon trading and carbon credits. And I think we know from our own work and also guests we've had on the podcast that there is going to have to be something in terms of carbon trading, offsetting or whatever, if we're ever going to achieve the results that we want. So what's basically happening with this is that there's been 3 chunks really that have come out from this on that. One of them is Article 6.2, which is about bilateral trading, and that's the trading of carbon credits between countries and private entities. And basically, without getting into, and we could have another session on it, because I don't think we want to go too far on this, but it's about having a more rigorous framework around how these happen, making them more. I think the conference has realised that the carbon trading piece has fallen into some disrepute with some bad actors in it and everything else. So what is going to be the outcome? They say that the outcome of Article 6.2 will reduce investor risk and clarify the pathway for countries to bring supply online. And so that could, they're saying that can support a ramp up in the issuance of correspondingly adjusted carbon credits in 2025 and beyond. My report I was reading said this is fantastic news for communities that host these projects, whether they be nature-based like reforestation and forest protection efforts, or community technology-based, such as those that disseminate cleaner burning household cook stoves. So it's pretty positive there. And they're saying the key agreement at the COP was that changes to authorisation can only occur under specific conditions which the host country must establish when giving the initial authorisation. I think there's going to be a lot of detail in that, but that's one. Then what do we get next? We get in Article 6.4 the new Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, the PACM. I think there's a rule you have to have 4 letters in your acronyms for doing this, and it's a successor to. You may recall there used to be a thing called the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. This is there to replace it, and they're talking about having standards, methodological and procedural requirements for projects that will be registered under it. So we're talking about quality standards for carbon projects. And again, this will be looking at improving both the quality and supply of carbon credits. So I think we can probably look at those along with they are introducing voluntary carbon market principles as well. I think these are things that have been long awaited, and we've often thought, we want some kind of global parity in how we deal with carbon issues. Now, will this lead to? It should lead to a better controlled, better quality carbon offset marketplace. I think is the short term heading there.
Certainly, the sooner they can do that, the better, I think. I mean, that would be great if that could be advanced in a very quick fashion.
Yeah. And then there was another little bit there, which was the Adaptation and Loss Damage Fund, which was going to build on what happened in COP28. And again, this is for the developing nations, and it's saying the conference made notable progress on adaptation by establishing a framework of up to 100 quantifiable indicators to measure implementation of the global goal on adaptation. So not earth-shattering stuff. And again, it's reckoned, wait for this, that they're talking about the pledges that are going to be there. But what they really need, they're talking about in 2030, they need $580 billion in annual losses and damages because of climate change. And there are people who go, it's not about the economy, is it, climate change? It's all tree hugging.
Yes.
So a headline that I've taken, and from what I've read as well, Baku failed to live up to its billing as the finance COP.
Fair enough.
It failed to it moved the needle a bit. I think that the carbon trading elements are all positive, but quite complex, and we'll need to understand what they are in detail. But that's the headline. So we haven't got something as outstanding as we've set a new global target, because I think at least this does say everybody's still accepting that the Paris Agreement, the 1.5, is what we should be working to. And I don't think the science has changed enough to suggest that we shouldn't be doing that. I think what has changed is our ability to meet it.
So since we launched this podcast in 2021, we've had a COP every year. We had COP 26 in 2021, 27 in 2022, 28 in 2023. Today we're sitting at COP 29 in 2024, and you've mentioned that we're having a COP30 in 2025. Are there any advantages or disadvantages, do you think, to holding these conferences annually?
Oh, yes and no. How about that for an answer? Let's go for that.
No simple answers here.
I think the yes answer is this is an incredibly important topic, and perhaps having something happening annually is good for keeping it in the headlines and giving it a sense of urgency. Quite frankly, how much can happen in the 12 months between each COP, I'm not really sure. But then I think where I'm going to go is I think probably we do need annuals, but they should be a stripped down version. They should be COP light, and then we should be having a COP heavy perhaps every 5 years. What do you think, Dave?
Well, I think things are just going to get worse, John. So I think 5 years would be, I actually understand what you're saying, because what I've been reading recently, regulations, even though governments put in regulations, they don't actually get enacted for 3 to 4 years, right? So just going based on that, if we're saying about this COP 29, it has to come back, it has to get approved. How long does it take? So maybe that's the merit of why you're saying it makes sense on the 5 years. My biggest thing is I think, I hope I'm wrong, but I think things are going to get worse and worse every year. So
yeah,
I hope I'm wrong.
I'm not. Lysandra.
Sorry, I'm just going to add, yeah, I like the idea of a COP light with, the players that are actually making the decisions and approving the decisions. I think every couple years, I think it's great to have thousands of delegates that are, getting re-inspired, talking to other countries, seeing what other countries are doing. However, we need to get to work. And in 1 year, how much work can we really do, especially if these key players are not at the table and are not making decisions? It seems, and again, I have never attended one, it kind of seems like a bit of a powwow, which is always great. But is it a powwow that actually gets things done, or is it just to all hold hands and say, hey, let's save the world and not actually do anything? That's kind of my biggest question. And again, I guess unless you've attended, you don't really know the true answer to that.
Yeah, I think, Lysandra, that's the issue. I think because we haven't attended, and this is a question we ask every year too, by the way.
Yeah.
But yet when you talk to people, they go, you know what? No, there's something to this. But I'd love to know what that means.
Right.
Does that mean there's something to it because you're getting something out of it, or is it actually moving the dial? Yeah, I can't. I guess if we went, or when we go, maybe we'd have a different thought process.
Yeah, well let's wait for it to come to Canada.
Hey, 2031.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. I used to sit on an ISO standards committee, and part of what we had to do, what we were trying to do there was get international agreement on a standard like 50,001 with 160 parties to it. So dial back a bit. How long? Let's just think about Canada. How long does it take your government to implement something like cap and trade or carbon tax?
Yeah, no.
Right. So you've got that. Now multiply that by 160 or 200.
Yes. And then in that 160 or 200, there's people trying to change what has been stated, right? Like there's a lot of activity going on even after this conference.
You're not all on the same page within one country, and all the countries aren't all on the same page. I think the best we might get of them all being on the same page is climate change is a big issue and we need to do something about it. I think that's the best agreement we've got. When we start moving away from that, then the interested parties, let's be blunt, if we were not the three of us from developed world talking about this, if we were from the undeveloped world, we would be banging on about why can't we have our piece of the action? Why can't we grow our economies? Why are we being held back? Because the other lot have polluted the atmosphere, and now they're saying that, we shouldn't be doing things.
I agree.
You can see that view.
Yeah, for sure.
I think even in one company, right? How difficult is it sometimes to make one change or agree on one thing? And now we're talking about thousands of companies being represented by one country, and all of these collaborating. It's just so many different headsets. I'm so curious how it actually is to be at COP and really what happens in the dynamic. I think we can't undercredit the excitement and inspiration this probably brings to a lot of the attendees. And I'm sure they come back, and I'm hoping that they go to their countries and they're making the positive change, because I know we've all talked about how sometimes those conferences do reignite you and remind you, what are we doing here? Why are we here to do this? So I'm sure there's some great takeaways there. I think we tend to be a little pessimistic on the COPs just because we are the outsider perspective, and I'm sure many of our listeners feel the same way as we do.
I'll take a really trivial example about getting an agreement. There's the three of us, right? Assume we're in the same room, and somebody says, I'm going to go out to the coffee shop and I'm going to get you all a drink, but you've all got to agree to have the same drink.
I only drink iced, John. How are we going to do this?
There you go.
I don't.
And nor do I.
And I'm an espresso drinker, and I like some vanilla in it. I take 2% milk. Hopefully you're all okay with that.
Yep. You see, Dave and I, we're going to go regular coffee with cream or milk, and you're going to have to go along with us. You can't have iced vanilla.
And I would agree. I would say, okay, there's 2 versus 1. They have the seniority. I will drink a hot coffee.
But is it just an ideal solution? No,
I would be sad.
Yeah. And I trivialize it there because I sometimes think that these big things, you need to look at just how difficult it is to come to decisions. And I'm going to say, I think there's an awful lot of people out of those thousands who went there, who really went there to make a change and to get something to happen.
Agreed. Well, to end off this episode, what's your biggest takeaway from COP29?
I think my biggest takeaway is it's going to be really interesting looking at the carbon trading elements of it. I think that's the bit that will probably have more direct impact on us in the short term. And it looks to me on the face of it, if it's going to be positive.
I think I totally agree. I think that if we could move that along quickly, I think it will be critical. The other piece is based because of my exposure to the sustainable finance and money flowing for this 300 billion or whatever, that they'll have to start working on that now, because financial institutions, green bond, things of that nature, that's going to have to be a big part of it, because as we discussed, governments don't have the money. So that would be an interesting exercise for financial institutions and the markets to actually start moving that way, if they do move that way. But I think they'll have to.
All right. Well, thank you both for another great COP episode.
and Lysandra, I noticed we're just under the 20 minutes again. So.
Oh yes, 45 minutes, very close to our 20-minute mark. We always aim to please here.
Well, we were saying about COP, they go up to the last minute.
So do we.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thank you
both.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.